Good morning, everyone, and welcome. If you saw me yesterday, well done for staying tuned / joining again this morning. This is the I'm going to try and work it out now. This is the beginning of the third day of our Cloud Security Week. But why are we here? So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, for those of you who've been in already, time to just finish off those coffee cups and get them at the table. So each cloud is unique. So what we want to try and do is give customers a bit of an understanding of a few different elements of cloud. So we've broken them up into 9 sessions. And we've been very lucky to bring together a number of cloud security leaders in various different areas of cloud, none more so than today's presenters. But what we're going to try and encourage is everyone to be a little bit interactive. So there'll be Q&As, polls of people who've seen. So what I'd really encourage you all to do is to not hold those questions in the back of your mind. Please do drop them into the chat box, and I'll do my very best to squeeze them in with our 2 presenters today. We walked through cloud fundamentals on day 1. And on day 2, yesterday, we covered public and hybrid cloud. What I really encourage people to do is actually to look out for the last lot of events online. So if you do have questions or interested in some of the other topics but haven't had the chance to join, we'll be making those available very shortly. So today, day 3, what are we concentrating on? So we're looking at cloud applications today. And specifically starting with Shadow IT this morning. If you're interested in a later session but not registered, and again, as I said, if you've missed a session, don't worry, it's no problem at all. You can dial back in later on today, or indeed watch the sessions on demand. So I'm potentially a little bit tired of the first one, but housekeeping. The fire exits joke, for some of us, that'll have been the 7th time they've heard that particular one. But again, polls and questions throughout today's session, so please do get involved. There'll be some interaction on the screen, so look out for those questions. We'll do our best. There is a slight delay between the presenters and what you're seeing. We'll do our very best to field those questions at the right time. The most important thing for me and for Shona, who spent time at Bytes putting these things together, is to have some good feedback at the end. So anything you can bring together to talk back about the content, the way these things have been put together, or if possible, some pats on the back for the presenters who've worked so hard to pull their slides and various different areas together, that'd be fantastic. And as ever, there'll be a prize draw for some of those feedback surveys later on. Right. On to some introductions and to look at what we're actually going to be fielding today. So the first part is we're going to be doing a very short introduction to Bytes for those of you who haven't worked with us before, for those of you who potentially do know us. But I think that today, after the merger last year, there's a few updates in terms of how we're going to market and work with customers that'll be useful. For those who haven't met me, my name is Jerry Edwards. I'm Head of Corporate and Enterprise Security here at Bytes. The first presenter today, looking at Shadow IT, the myths and the maths, is John from Forcepoint. We'll then have a short poll in terms of looking at those answers in the Q&A. So again, I'm going to urge you again, please do field some questions for John. We'll then be bringing Neil Thacker from Netscope to look at creating complete cloud visibility and control, specifically focusing here on the best practice models, again followed by a Q&A. So hopefully with those 2, we'll get a really good overview of those particular areas from 2 market leaders. We'll then cover very shortly how Bytes are helping customers within these different areas, and just finish off with an open panel Q&A. So looking forward to you all bringing plenty of questions to that particular part. So for those of you who may be very well familiar with Bytes software services, there's a market-leading Microsoft VAR. we've actually spent 20 years working in the security space. Over the last, certainly the last decade, we've added some really exciting areas to our business. And it's culminated in us delivering around about £100 million worth of security projects last year. So there's a really good opportunity to talk to Bytes about a number of different areas. We do like to, I guess, add to the various different strings to our bow, none more so than some of the areas around managed security and cybersecurity over the last 4 to 5 years. So if you haven't had an opportunity to talk to us about those areas, please do get in touch with your account manager, or indeed speak to Shona through the marketing side of things. In terms of where we finished today, we actually now have 65 security specialists working within Bytes. And that's been centered around the delivery of our direct to engineer support team. They've been working with technologies like Forcepoint and indeed Netscope and a multitude of other technologies, looking at delivering projects. But actually, if we look at some of the stats on there, we actually resolve over 3,000 support issues in-house for customers. So we're taking a really keen interest in both the technology, but also the way that technology is successfully implemented from a technical aspect within customers. As I alluded to on the last slide, we're seeing more and more an interest in our certified cyber consulting, but also our managed security portfolio. So what does this, I guess, look like for customers today in terms of the delivery models and the ways in which customers can interact with Bytes? No doubt a lot of you will be very familiar with the procurement services that dovetail nicely with SAM and Microsoft. But in security as well, we hold a fantastic number of very high level accreditations being backed through some of the award-winning partnerships that we have. But we try to provide now, in introducing the cyber consulting, a full, I guess what you would call a full security lifecycle management process through the number of different teams that we're able to develop here at Bytes. So that doesn't just include technology, it obviously includes process, business process, policy. So please do come and talk to us about those various different areas. So in context for today's conversation, what's the scope of the problem and is it a problem? So there are a number of different areas that sort of come together with this, and that is that shadow IT it can sometimes be seen as a problem, or is it a symptom? What's causing it? But the reality is that shadow IT, in essence, I guess on the positive side, is actually a way of moving towards high levels of productivity and collaboration. Okay, all of these apps, ways of communicating between different areas of business and people, is all about the speed of business. And potentially one could say that shadow IT, or at least controlling shadow IT, is going to be a real serious essence of the networks of the future. From a less positive point of view, I think we're seeing that people are concerned about a loss of boundaries, certainly a lack of visibility, and a loss of control. And that's, I guess, is where the whole phrase shadow IT really comes from. We're in an age of high levels of, I guess, IT savviness from our employees, millennials speeding into the workplace who understand how fast they want to collaborate. But with that brings potentially an increased risk of breach or loss of data, but certainly a loss of understanding of where that data is and how we control it. So shadow IT, certainly for me, has been a very significant focus for those discussions and recent discussions with customers. Right, so hopefully, just to check our poll systems are working, you will have seen a poll this morning asking you about how you like your coffee or whether you've had enough. And remarkably, a high percentage of you have said that you're civilized and you drink tea. Well, I can tell you that I'm still on the coffee this morning, so 2 or 3 shots in there ready to go. So without further ado, if we move on to our first session, I'd like to introduce John from Forcepoint. John.
Cheers, thank you. Thanks very much for that intro. So let's see, is my slide clicker working? That's the most important. First test. There we go, fantastic. So just to get us started this morning with a nice easy session. We really wanted to kind of go over some of the things to consider around shadow IT and the sorts of things which you need to bear in mind when you're looking at potentially adopting some of the shadow IT which is in use in your organization. So start off very quickly, we'll frame it. What actually is shadow IT? We probably know, but there's quite often gaps once we start drilling into it. Then we'll talk about what the risks are. We'll understand why it's so attractive to users and some of the ways that can then shape our governance policies. That will obviously feed into what the rewards are. And then ultimately, what should we do about it? Because we can't do nothing. So what is shadow IT? Now, when the topic of shadow IT comes up, I often hear comments along the lines of, oh, right, you mean unsanctioned apps like Dropbox, right? Or sometimes it mean, oh yeah, you mean when people are using their iPads for work, right? And both of those things are correct in and of themselves, but it actually goes far beyond that. Shadow IT, as its name suggests, and as we've just been alluding to, it's the use of information technology, so any systems, devices, software, application services, any of that, where you don't have explicit IT department approval in advance. Now, it's not a new thing. It's been around for a long time, but it's really started coming to the fore with the real emergence of cloud and mobile as being the dominant technologies of our age. And I think it's also worth noting that just because IT say no doesn't mean that users will necessarily stop using shadow IT. So for example, I'm not aware of many IT departments which are happy with business being conducted over WhatsApp, and yet it's a really common communication tool which is used between colleagues, between customers, basically everywhere I go around the world when I'm speaking to customers. So what might shadow IT look like? We've talked about how it could be anything which isn't initially sanctioned by the IT department. Where we tend to see the most dominant features is around things like chat apps, note-taking, other software like mind mapping tools, collaboration tools. Also more traditional shadow IT, things like local hard disks, USB keys, printing. And then there's quite a few things which often drop below the radar. Things like device syncing and these kinds of cloud-based services which allow all your devices to act as one. But what it means is all that data you're working with is actually traveling over the network and quite often going through other people's servers and being stored in other places. Now, this is Cloud Security Week, right? So some of you might already be thinking, well, why am I even bringing up things like, SSD drives or USB keys and local printers when surely the focus wants to be about the cloud applications and cloud storage? And the reason for that is that even though the data might live in the cloud, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay there. And in order to protect our cloud data, we need to actually be able to not just control access to it in those cloud services, but actually, once it's been downloaded or retrieved onto local devices by the users, still control where it's going. And actually, it's the shadow IT for those local devices as well as for cloud services, which often is the biggest gap. And that actually leads us straight into our first poll. What kind of shadow IT do you personally use? Yeah. So there's a couple of key categories to think about here. It might be personal computing devices like, iPads, maybe you're in an environment where it's a Windows only house, but you want to work with a Mac, so you've bought your own Mac. Could be personal storage, might be a USB key. It might be consumer cloud services like Dropbox and so on. Local applications, again, the note-taking, the presentation apps, the mind maps, these kinds of things. Even when they're local application running on your device, there's usually a cloud component, be that cloud storage or cloud syncing as well. And then perhaps the focus for this session really is the cloud applications and services themselves. So for example, I love using group whiteboarding apps, tools like Miro, those kinds of things, because they really help with the remote working, which we're all going through thanks to the current pandemic. And then there's the other devices, which again, often get forgotten, things like the cameras, the AV equipment for presentations, printers, so on and so forth. So hopefully you've got a poll popping up on the side of your screen. If you could put some feedback into the sorts of shadow IT which you use and your organizations use, what we'll do when we get to the end and we get to the Q&A section, we'll review the figures which come back, and then we'll talk about some of the patterns which we see emerging from this group. So what are the risks of shadow IT? In a lot of ways, this is actually quite easy because we know them, right? It's the lack of visibility, the lack of control we were just talking about. And left uncontrolled, that can actually lead to spiraling IT costs. You know, the ongoing day-to-day management of having to deal with different applications or things which are breaking the sanctioned applications, or just confusing things for the IT team to have to keep up with. You know, it can really become quite a burden quite quickly. And then the real crux of it, the really important part is there's all kinds of data risks, from whether it's data proliferation, loss, theft, these kinds of things, right? Because that's then where it starts to get expensive. If we think about these in perhaps more formal terms, then we're worried about the CIA risks, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability model. If the only copy of your vital business data is on somebody's personal device, what happens if that gets lost or stolen? Or it's just not backed up properly and it fails? What happens if, because they're not behind the corporate security stack, that somehow gets compromised or interfered with? How can you rely on it? And then that can then bring all kinds of GRC risks for governance, the risk management, and the compliance controls. How can you ensure compliance for your organization if you actually don't have that visibility of where your data is and how it's being used and who it's been shared with? How can you actually make sensible risk management decisions about what to adopt or not if you don't know what's going on? So it all feeds back to these issues of the lack of visibility and control we've been talking about. And of course, what that all ultimately boils down to is financial risks. It's not just the day-to-day operations, although that in itself can be significant. There's also the possibility of things like fines for non-compliance. But actually, the biggest risk and the biggest threat to any organization is going to be if they lose the competitive edge, or if there is sensitive data is no longer confidential, it's made public. That can have a really significant impact on organizations. And whatever that data is, it will vary depending on the organization. So for Forcepoint, we're a security vendor. We write software, so it could be source code. For those of you in the audience who are from the NHS, it would be things like patient data. In manufacturing, it might be design blueprints. Everybody will have personal data. All these things can ultimately lead to a financial cost if that data is not protected. And shadow IT is a hole through your normal defenses. So one of the things which we've discovered is that most people are actually aware of these risks, and they just get on and do it anyway. So if everybody kind of knows that there are risks, why do they do it anyway? What makes shadow IT so attractive? And it turns out most people are actually not very good at measuring risk. And so they just think it'll be all right. It won't happen to me. And anyway, the bad guys, why would they be interested in us? They're never going to come near us. It's going to be fine. So they end up taking actually outside risks for what are potentially quite small rewards, just because they don't appreciate the risk. If we look at this guy in the middle with the golf club, with the golf ball in his mouth, what was his thought process? He's thinking, oh, brilliant. I'm going to be on Instagram. I'm going to go viral. I'm going to get 15 minutes of fame. Yeah, better hope your mate doesn't miss with a golf club. the risk is actually really significant based on the reward. And we can model that and map those kinds of thinkings into the business environment. So what are the rewards which make users think, oh, I'll just ignore the process, I'll ignore the rules, or I'll just try stuff out without asking? Again, a lot of this is quite straightforward. By using their own tools or selecting the own applications and services to work with, it empowers them to do their best work. If they use their preferred tools, so they work faster. Often it allows them to avoid irritations and to reduce inefficiencies. Why do people use WhatsApp to communicate with customers? Because it's quick and it's immediate, but it's also asynchronous. So everybody knows that there's this conversation going on. They know when the message has been read. It's more immediacy than email. So there's a better experience for the customer. It's a better experience for the worker. The only problem is it's now going through a third-party systems, and you've lost that control, you've lost that assurance, and it might actually be going through a different country, and it's breaking compliance regulations, which your organization is legally bound to stick to. But for the user, it's just less irritating. The cost to them is externalized, so they don't feel it in the same way. It also enables them to adapt more readily to customer demands and changing circumstances. And it just makes work more enjoyable. And human nature is, if it makes life easier, makes life more fun, and if they're doing better work, they're probably going to be better rewarded. Well, why wouldn't they do it? If it's so good for users, but it creates these risks, it can be tempting to introduce like the banhammer and just try to block it all. But actually, there are some rewards for the business as well. By enabling users to adopt these tools, it enables user innovation, which will actually accelerate business. It will boost productivity. We just heard a moment ago about, going at the speed of business and accelerating. That's what it's all about. Also, from a business point of view, because it improves staff satisfaction, it can improve staff retention. And actually, happy staff work longer, they work harder. By embracing shadow IT and by adopting some of these tools which the users are finding for themselves, it then actually allows IT to regain visibility and control. Instead of saying, no, you can't use that, you say, yes, of course you can, but then you just apply some controls so you get that visibility back. And you don't get the resistance from the users when you're enabling them to use their tools that you do sometimes get when you're trying to dictate how they have to work. And because you're regaining that visibility and control, embracing shadow IT also improves security, which obviously is the ultimate goal for any security organization, any security team. And all of these things, because suddenly everybody's pulling in the same direction, they're working together towards a common goal, it can actually reduce costs rather than make them spiral as well. So, sounds like shadow IT is something that we probably want to adapt, right? But how do we choose which tools we want to adopt or tolerate versus the ones which actually we probably do want to block? So I always like to use analogies from the real world because I think it makes it easier for a lot of people to relate to. So if you take a look at the picture on the right here, what is happening, right? There's a clear process here, right? There's a clear rule. Follow the path to get to the entrance, right? But lots of people ignored that to the point it ruined their lawn. What did the organization do? They put up a fence and said, no, use the path. What did the users do? Yeah, whatever, the path's too far away. They took a different route. Now, why did they do that? Who thinks that actually the path's in the wrong place? Right? Enough people have worn a second new path that there's got to be a good reason for it. Why wasn't the fence effective? And I think this analogy is something which we can apply to organizations, because so many security controls are nothing but fences that the users are constantly trying to work around. Now, it could be that actually the path in question, it was a design flaw, or maybe it was outdated, right? So if we understand how users want to work with their data and work with the systems, then that can help us adapt to the way that users are working. Maybe that the path we see on the right here, the designed path, was the wrong solution. Maybe the designer just didn't know about the user's preferred flow. And so from users' experience, though, the cost, if you like, of not following the path, of taking their own route, a bit of worn grass, whatever, that even if there's fines for walking on the grass, the chances of getting caught are pretty slim. So the costs outweighed by the benefits of having a shorter path to the destination which you want to go to. All right. Now, out of interest, who here thinks that the people walking on those paths, are they bad? Should they be punished? Is that ever actually effective? Or perhaps the solution is actually a new path. Now, at Forcepoint, a big part of our engineering group is based out of Helsinki in Finland. And they do something really interesting. All right. After the snowfall, every year, the people who manage the city parks, they look for where people walk. The reason being that when the snow, all the paths, all the grass, all the lawns, they're all covered up. So people just take whatever route makes the most sense for any given journey. And what the city planners do, they actually map those new paths, and where it goes over, a piece of the park, there isn't a proper path already. Once the snow clears, they build a new path. So what we're trying to say here, if you like, the big message is that we might not always get it right first time, but if we watch what our users are doing, if we watch what they're doing to make themselves more efficient, then we can actually adapt to better ways of working. If we bring that back to an IT security point of view, we can actually help them boost the productivity and boost the security at the same time. So a couple of easy examples. If the staff in your organization are all using, things like consumer Dropbox and cloud-based storage solutions, maybe that's highlighting a need that the organization could adopt. Make a cloud-based file sharing and file storage system available so users can then actually use a sanctioned version of that app, which IT can then provide some monitoring controls for. If people are using WhatsApp to communicate all the time, perhaps the current way of dealing with customers isn't the best, and maybe we should be looking at using like instant messaging tools and collaboration tools, things like move away from WhatsApp, which is out of your control, to things like Slack or Teams, which can be in your control. So when we think about the different things which we've got with Shadow IT, we have a decision to make, right? Do you want to allow it? Do you want to adopt it? Or do you just want to block it? Now, in my experience, prohibition is far less effective than actually embracing that demand and just layering on some control. Now, one of the best ways to get the business to buy into adopting these new tools is to adopt or to provide an economic argument. So if we could pop up the second poll question here, which is, when you're looking at Shadow IT within your organization, are you applying a monetary value to the risk involved in the Shadow IT? What could be the costs if something goes wrong? But also to the reward. What are the benefits? And again, if you could fill in the answers as we're going, we'll come back to that for the Q&A at the end. So I guess what we're trying to say here is that if we embrace the user innovation, the tools which are being adopted by users through their shadow IT, whether that's local applications, cloud services, yeah, then we can really help drive business benefits. And I put this quote up here from Steve Jobs because I really think this summarizes the viewpoint really well. He says, it doesn't make sense to hire smart people and then tell them what to do. All right. Nobody likes to be told what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do. Smart people who are engaged will drive better business. Whether that's on-premise, mobile, and especially in the modern world, in the cloud. Oh, so at this point, we should actually have the third poll, please. And that's really to understand, do you restrict access to the data for different applications? What actually do you permit and what actually do you restrict in your organization? Again, if you can answer the questions, we'll get onto the Q&A in just a moment. So if you've decided that actually I see some value in shadow IT, what are the next steps? Well, the first one will be to implement a cloud and a shadow IT governance process. All right. And my colleague Neil will take you through the steps on how to do that in the next section after the Q&A. One of the key parts of that will very much be documenting your shadow IT estate. Discover what your users are doing. Find out what they're using, but not just what, why are they using those tools? What need is that surfacing? What benefit is that bringing to the organization? And when you're doing that, calculate a financial range for the different risks and rewards associated with those tools, because that will really help you with your governance decisions. And it will also, if you need to go to the board for a budget request, it will really help you secure that budget in a way that requests without numbers attached just cannot do. And if some of this is a bit new, or you want to work with some people who've got experience in this area already, then please do engage with Bytes and engage with Forcepoint so that we can work through these processes with you and help you secure your users and your data. And ultimately, if you embrace shadow IT, you can embrace more cloud with confidence by adopting it safely. So, thank you for listening to me speak. I think at this point, we're on for the Q&A.
Thanks, John. It's I think one of the things that I found really interesting is that we actually didn't get the chance to, I guess, confer too much on my very basic introductory slide material and the focus of and depth of what you talked about there. But it's really good to see that there's that focus on speed of business, but thinking about where some of those users are going. I particularly like the analogy with the pathway. And I have to say, I hadn't actually used that in the past at all. So that was just really interesting to see. We do have, before we get on to any additional questions, we do have obviously the results of the first poll. And again, something that, that you and I had a very short chat about just before we went on air was sort of where we felt some of these questions and polls might go. So if I just read through that particular poll there, what kind of shadow IT do you use was the question. And the options were personal computing devices, personal storage, local applications, cloud applications, other devices, and then the wonderful one, which is don't know. That don't know got 14 to 15%, by the way. So there is a small part of the audience that are being honest in terms of understanding that particular point. But interestingly enough, personal computing devices took 36% of the poll. Whereas obviously there's generally more of a, I guess, a sort of discussion focus on local applications and cloud applications.
Mhm.
Where do you think that particular piece around personal computing devices is leading?
I'd be very interested to, unfortunately, when I defined the poll, I didn't think to separate out, laptops from mobiles and iPads and so on. But as I sort of mentioned during the slides, the dominant areas where I see for personal devices, it's really around collaboration tools, whether that's WhatsApp, Slack, Signal, Telegram, these types of messaging apps are really popular. Also around note-taking apps. So I myself, for example, I use GoodNotes on my iPad. And I've gone through a series. I use mind mapping tools. I've got a preferred mind mapping tool. Within Forcepoint, there is a sanctioned mind mapping tool. I don't like that one. It doesn't fit my brain. So I've got a different one, which is tolerated by the organization. So when I went through, I actually made a list of my own shadow IT, and it was kind of like, crikey, I've got about 20 things here which I use, which Forcepoint, either they've grudgingly tolerated it, in several cases they've formally adopted it, and actually in some cases they still don't know because they haven't picked it up yet. And for me personally, that's particularly around some of the syncing tools. I've got a clipboard manager, right? And it not only does it keep a month's worth of all my clipboard cuttings, it syncs across all my devices, including my corporate laptop, my private home machine, my iPad, and my phones, right? So these kinds of tools are really, really interesting. They're very powerful tools, but they are actually things which organizations, particularly anybody with compliance restrictions, where GRC, the governance, risk management, and compliance is a really significant requirement. You need to be very careful about those tools, because even people like me, I've been in the industry 20 years. I try to be a good guy, but even I'm actually using a tool, and it was part of setting up this session where I went, I should probably be a good Boy Scout and go and talk to IT.
I think there was something you said. I mean, I'm a technophobe, so I still take notes on not that everyone can see that, but on in a notepad, and then I try to bring them into the digital world over time as kind of thoughts move forward. But one of the things I found particularly interesting is that a number of years ago, I had the fortune of working with a company who realised that the people coming into the business probably knew better how to deliver their workload, how to work with various different bits and pieces. And they decided that they were going to go down the route of what was then Forcepoint WSGA, or I should say WebSense, using their application control and Web 2.0 controls a lot more deeply, because they realized that if they open these up but provide some sensible DLP controls to make sure nobody made a faux pas, actually they could enable their users to go out and do what they needed to do using the things they wanted to, with an element of visibility. So I find it quite interesting that we talk about the risk of shadow IT and not what it enables. But based on the next poll, which is, do you apply a monetary value to shadow IT? And I think of the queries were yes, shadow IT risk, and we got 33% there. Shadow IT reward got just 8%, which I still, as current conversation standing, very interesting. And then no was a very, very interesting, nearly 60% of the vote there.
Yeah, and that is, broadly speaking, typical of our experience, is that shadow IT is this thing which is almost overtaking the industry because of the emergence of cloud as the dominant platform, because of the emergence of mobility and the ability to work anytime, anywhere. It's so empowering, but it's opening up these risks. But a lot of the, if you like, the governance controls, they're still scrambling to catch up. And because the governance controls are scrambling to catch up, going and requesting budget to adopt some of these new ways of working, that's not happening. And you know what? If you're not going asking for budget, you're probably not putting monetary values on it yet.
I was going to say, do you think there's a bit of I think there's definitely a lack of understanding to a degree in terms of just reimagining what you might call legacy tool sets.
Yes.
There has been this ability to visualize, define, control some of these elements to a degree. But as we really look into both sets of technologies that we're talking to today, yourself, Forcepoint, Neil, with Netscope, both companies working really hard to help the industry and end users and our customers reimagine what SWG and CASB really have to offer customers, and also to make sure that they have an appetite, which I guess is interesting again to sort of the previous poll about are you monetizing the value of shadow IT, and a staggering aspect of 60% is no. We are trying very hard to deliver or reshape that particular message. So that's that. I'm glad we will do what we can together to work with all our customers and hopefully people who are attending today to help them reimagine the tools that they have in that aspect. So I'm just a bit conscious of time here, John. So we're going to move on to having a discussion with Neil. But thank you very much for the insight there, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss a couple more of those areas a little bit more broadly towards the end. But thank you very much, John.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So without further ado, we are going to introduce Neil Thacker, someone who has spent an enormous amount of time working in this particular area, having come from a customer/consumer background and moved into the industry. So please, Neil, hopefully you're on the line and moving on to a 5-step model for controlling cloud.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Bytes for the invitation. A special thanks to Shona for doing an amazing job to deliver this week-long education series. It's been pretty challenging times. So yeah, thank you for all your efforts in doing so. Thank you to everyone that's attended as well. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come along to the sessions this morning. So yeah, my name is Neil Thacker. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for EMEA for Netscope. I've spent over 20 years in information security. So yeah, from the kind of customer side, I was at Deutsche Bank, Swiss Re, so spent a number of years in financial services before moving outside of the city. And I was at Camelot, the national lottery operator, for 6 years, kind of running security operations there. So really across those 20 years, I've seen obviously this explosion of cloud, of course, predominantly over the last 10 years. But again, I'm actually working with a number of, again, some of the largest organizations in the world, some of the most well-known organizations in the world around their cloud security program. I also sit on the advisory board to the Cloud Security Alliance. And also I'm the kind of cloud specialist for ENISA, the European Agency for Cybersecurity. So I get involved in their threat landscape there. So today I've really kind of focused on harnessing all of that knowledge, all of that expertise, all of my involvement in my day-to-day job, as well as CISO at Netscope, to kind of bring to you a 5-step model. It's Thursday morning. I thought it's the perfect time to introduce a new model to you. Friday is not a good day to introduce new concepts, but Thursday is the ultimate day to do that. So this is what I'm going to do today. Before I get started, a very quick introduction to Netscope if you're not familiar. Netscope are a leader and a visionary in the various analysts' magic quadrants. And as I said, we work with some of the largest organizations across the globe. We were one of the first CASBs on the market. Gartner coined the term in 2012. That's when Netscope was founded, and we had our first CASB product in 2013. We were also the first organization to offer a next-gen secure app gateway. If you love or hate the term, I apologize. But again, it's typically what we've seen. We've had to introduce, again, these new technologies because of, again, some of the challenges that John highlighted, right? This rapid adoption and move to cloud. So again, I'm going to start off with focusing on kind of the 6 key areas where that organizations are really wanting to prioritize. And this is ultimately under the single banner of reducing risk, reducing friction, reducing cost. Now, again, if I speak to my board today, that is the one I mean, those three words are music to their ears. If I can articulate and demonstrate and have metrics on how I'm reducing risk, reducing friction in the business, reducing cost, I'm on a winning path. So, of course, what we typically see, and this was a survey that was run by ESG, ultimately on what CISOs and CIOs want. And it is around, again, the first step here, mitigating risk, improving security posture, using, again, the models out there, using empirical data to prove that you're doing this is key. Second is around centralizing policy. We know always that complexity is the enemy. If you've read any of the recent kind of Ponemon studies around cost breaches and cost breach avoidance, it highlights that complexity is one of the number one amplifying factors for, again, breach costs. Leading into point 3, we know that all CISOs and CIOs want to deploy new controls rapidly. They don't want to kind of take them 6 to 12 months and sometimes even longer than that to deploy a new control. And that's ultimately where we've seen this kind of shift to organizations choosing services, not necessarily appliances. Again, the fourth point here around looking at security, thinking about some of the things that, again, also John was talking about, right? That the majority of time shadow IT is used by an organization and chosen by the business is because they can actually get much better performance, and actually they get much better end user satisfaction by doing so. And sometimes what happens is that they intentionally bypass the security control because that adds latency, right? It's very rare for a security control to improve performance. So again, they're actually already seeing the benefits here of going direct to cloud, direct to net. But from an organization perspective, that of course increases risk. Fifth point here is around threat detection and response. We know, again, as somebody that's worked in security operations, time to detection is key. Reducing that time to detection is, again, paramount, right? It's how you, again, ultimately support the organization, how you also reduce those breach costs. If a breach is inevitable, then we need to make sure that when it happens, that, again, the cost to the organization is minimized. And then finally, in the same topic as costs, thinking about this as the final pillar for this slide, it ties back into the whole reduce risk, reduce friction, reduce cost. If we can do all of these things, but also at the same time reduce cost, then again, we're on that winning path. So this is the kind of challenge that we've seen. And I think it's important to understand how that network traffic profile has changed. And John spoke about this, right? The proliferation of all of these devices that are coming into our organization. And it's something that's happened over the last 10 years. It's not anything new. We all know that we have many devices connecting to many services. So, of course, what's happened is over that period of time, new technologies like, again, CASB, an 8-year-old technology, has been introduced for most organizations. We see this actually, I think the stats today are that by next year, 60% of enterprises will have a CASB. What we're seeing, though, is that the kind of this evolution of CASB. We're seeing this evolution away from kind of just the API inspection capability where a CASB connects into a cloud service, but looking at the CASB as an inline component. And in fact, the majority of Netscope customers that started off with a kind of our API capability moved to inline quite quickly because of all the additional benefits. Those benefits are kind of summarized in this type of slide, right? We can see that this evolution from CASB to SASE, if you're, again, if you like the term SASE or not, this is where we see most organizations already on that path. So they're looking at utilizing, again, the SASE and utilizing CASB as a microservice. And as I said, the majority of organizations are on this journey today. If they know it or not, they're already on this journey because of their consumption of cloud, web, legacy. And of course, Jeremy referred to this before, right? Building up networks of the future. This is ultimately what most organizations are looking at as a kind of the network of the future, not having separate silos, not having separate policy engines, looking at centralized configuration and policies and running this through, again, a centralized network. I spin this model on its side because it's important to understand how organizations are accelerating, again, performance at the same time. So the blue rings here, typically your networks controls, improving performance, improving that fast access to, again, services you're consuming. And the orange discs here are your security controls. So you're, in many cases, you're buying back that latency by increasing performance and also adding security controls. So that's the kind of, again, the kind of initial focus really of where most organizations and where they're looking to, of course, allow shadow IT, adopt new applications, but also apply new security controls. So I wanted to introduce a kind of a 5-step model. So by doing this, what type of security controls do we need to consider? How do we prioritize them as well? So where do we start? How do we mature, perhaps even existing controls we have? And again, what does actually work in organizations? And again, as I said, I work with some of the largest organizations in the world. I speak on a regular basis to CISOs. I attend their quarterly business review meetings, looking at how they're kind of maturing their cloud security program. Each of these steps I'll highlight today has some kind of key deliverables. Now, of course, some organizations have, of course, increased deliverables across certain phases. But here, again, I've just taken the most common deliverables across each one of those 5 stages. And the 5 stages are really important. I mean, if I break them down, again, we have the discover phase. So really understanding the risk exposure your organization has from the cloud. Second stage is around how you prioritize. So once you understand those risks, which risks do you take on and aim to minimize, even transfer, through to protect. So typically how an organization then applies a form of control that, again, protects their employees, because that's as a CISO, that's our ultimate goal, is to protect our employees and to protect our organization. Through to, again, how we can actually use the same information to educate our employees. So education is key, because we know that, again, people will always make mistakes, no matter how often you test them. Phishing tests have kind of proven this. We can test people on a regular basis, and somebody will still, unfortunately, fall for this type of activity, again, a phishing attack. But if we now think about how this relates to cloud, again, the same type of education needs to be run, and it needs to be run on a consistent and continuous basis, not just as a kind of one-off or once-a-year type of assessment, all the way through to governance. And this is where we see organizations really kind of colliding their cloud security model with their approach to data governance. So if any of you are in that stage where you've got data custodians and you're sharing out reports with individuals across the organization, you're decentralizing risk. Again, this is a key area where we see organizations wanting to get to within a very short space of time. So you can see here, these are the 5 steps. And what I'll do today is I'll go through each one of those steps and just go into a bit more detail around some of the key deliverables at each step. So if I start off with the kind of first one, the first key deliverable, of course, is understanding profile. Most frameworks start off with this, right? You need to identify your key assets. You need to identify your key data assets. What is critical to the organization? You have to do that, right? It's we always say it's impossible to try to protect what you can't see. Visibility at this point is absolutely key. The important part to mention is, again, and John highlighted this, right? The proliferation of shadow IT. We see about the average enterprise organization using over 1,200 cloud services. And they could be cloud apps, they could be SaaS apps, they could be infrastructure, so IaaS, they could be, again, other platforms. There's a lot of cloud services that are being consumed today in most organizations. So having instant visibility into those apps becomes key. Now, of course, you can go through and run surveys and questionnaires and try to get this information. What we've seen is that this information becomes quickly out of date. Right? This data can change, and this information can change week in, week out. So it's critical that you're constantly collecting this information. The second part is around creating the inventory around who owns each cloud app. So, for instance, again, from a high-level perspective, is it IT, security? Is it business-owned? Ultimately, which kind of business owner owns each of those applications? And you don't have to get too complex around this. You can start, again, collating certain apps into certain categories and start assigning kind of ownership there. It could be by department rather than individuals. And it's actually really relatively easy to get this information from that use of cloud, again, by looking at this type of traffic that's going through a CASB. That will give you all of that information to hand. And all you have to do is simply go through and label these applications. Something we've seen from, again, quite a few organizations is they also then start applying a tier, like a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 to each application. And that will actually affect the types of controls that they look to apply a bit later on in the process. Third step is around looking at a high risk activity. So this is tying things such as third-party risk that may be typically assigned to a cloud service provider where there's an immediate concern. And I'll give you an example here. So for instance, we worked recently with an organization. The first thing they found was there's a large consumption of a SaaS service that had been built for them by a third party. They didn't realize that this was hosted on fourth party infrastructure, and it was actually hosted in China. Now for them, for their, again, the regulations they had to deal with, they immediately saw this was an issue. So they saw this traffic flow, they saw the data that was being hosted outside of a specific jurisdiction, and they put a control in place to inhibit and block that activity. Again, so sometimes shadow IT is great at supporting the organization. Sometimes it can also hinder, and it's having that visibility into high risk services with high risk data flow. Another example was an organization using Teams. They were using, they realized they were using over 30 Teams instances. So not just, again, their own corporate instance of Teams, but also various third parties and their supply chain were all using Teams to collaborate. And they realized that, again, there was some confidential data that was being shared using those Teams instances that shouldn't really have been going to those third parties. So they realized at that point in time that, again, there was a high risk concern, and they looked to actually put in controls to minimize that. When we start looking at prioritizing, again, this is linking everything back to a business process. So why that application is being used, for what purpose, tying this back into things such as a GRC function, if you have a GRC function, if you have an internal audit function, again, working with them to understand, again, which applications are being used and what kind of certain checks have been performed on those providers. If it's shadow IT and it's being used for, again, a specific business process, there should be a record of this within the internal audit function. And then kind of step 6 is around looking at the information. So now making this around not so much about application centric, but making it more data centric and building decisions around, again, what data, how is that data controlled, who's responsible. Utilizing the shared responsibility model here is really key, because you could say, for instance, that the cloud service provider is responsible for, again, running the platform, running the back-end infrastructure, but ultimately the customer is always going to be responsible for who has access to this and who applies data protection. Again, it's usually the customer within that regard. So step 3, again, once you're across this phase, it's now looking at kind of putting in layers of protection. Now, some organizations fast track this because they, as I highlighted, they see an immediate risk to the organization and they quickly put in a policy. What we see the average organization get into this point within 90 days. And again, applying those policies to manage high-risk services. And again, this is where it gets interesting as well, because they start assigning certain risk levels to each application. And again, this can be done manually with lots of CASB solutions like Netscope, and I know Forcepoint have this as well. You can assign a score to each application, and it gives you, again, something you can base your policies on this, right? A contextual score to kind of assist within your policy configuration. So what I wanted to do before I kind of jump into the next steps is focus on kind of step 3 and where you are as your organization. So I'd like to kind of start up the first poll, because I think the next step is really important, is how do you use this and educate employees and make them aware of cloud security risks? So the poll question is exactly that. How do you educate employees and make them aware of cloud security risks? Is it A, incorporate education into annual security awareness training? Is it B, run regular cloud security training workshops, focus on those cloud risks? Is it, again, do you already have a CASB? Are you applying block policies in your CASB? D is, are you using pop-up warnings, warning employees of high-risk activity before you actually follow up with that policy enforcement? Is it E, do you do all of the above? Are you already in that phase where you're using kind of the regular annual security awareness training, the controls, the policies, the education within the tool? Other, we can probably try and discuss that offline another time. Or is it finally G? Again, this will be for the very honest people on the attendees. Again, you don't make employees aware of any cloud security risks. So again, we'll cover the answers to this poll towards the end of the session. What we typically see is that how organizations see this, right? This is, again, a real world an example. And again, I'm picking on Jeremy here. So Jeremy, I apologize. Well, I'm picking on you because I don't believe you're a technophobe. Right? I know you have more devices and you use more cloud applications than you have virtual books on your bookshelf behind you. I know this for a fact. Right? We've seen this activity. We know you're using these services. But the thing is, we know Jeremy can't process and assess risk across 40,000 applications. He's good, but he's not that good. He doesn't have a catalog of 40,000 apps in his head, and he can make decisions very quickly based on that activity. I know he reads most terms and conditions, but not all. So this isn't actually what we see for most organizations. We know that, again, most employees are not going to read terms and conditions. They're going to assume that because somebody else is using this application, then I can use this too. And actually, we've seen this, and John mentioned this as well, these new apps that allow you to communicate and contact people and share information and make this information available. Again, even our marketing team and Netscope have recommended we start using these tools. And I've gone to the vendor's page, and they have no privacy policy. They've been breached in the past. Their contact list is available to everybody, and it's quite a scary type thought to say, well, I'm going to allow people in my organization to use that application. So sometimes you have to be the bad guy, and also block these things. But in most situations, you have to make the decision based on context. You can't do this based on just saying no. You have to tell the reason why you're not allowing the use of a certain application. So again, this is just one example of how you can help automate risk-based conditional access control, looking at device risk. So in this case, it's one of Jeremy's many personal devices that he uses. It looks like a clipboard, but underneath, no, it's again, a smart device. He's accessing many applications using that device. He's uploading and downloading data and collaborating with third parties. And of course, there's going to be an element of risk that gets involved here. So we can now take action, and we can start putting in policies to can mitigate those risks. And also, in many cases, just educate Jeremy so that if there is a risk, we can tell him first and get him to make a decision on this if he wants to proceed or not. And the interesting thing is we've got a number of organizations that use this metric to present to their board in terms of, again, their employee risk. So they'll go to their board meetings, going and saying, look, in the last month, we've seen this type of activity, and we've actually been able to educate our employees and reduce the number of again, high risk shadow IT use by 92%. That's a stat we worked with a financial services organization to reduce this. Beforehand, they were potentially losing thousands and thousands of files, sensitive data, confidential data, again, out to shadow IT apps. By using education, giving somebody an option to say, go ahead, or actually, I now see that there's a potential risk here, I'm not going to continue. Again, 92% of people said, no, I don't want to continue because I now realize the risk. That's a huge number to consider. So you can see this type of model really, really works in terms of how you start managing that access. And this comes into nicely in terms of that fourth phase where we start focusing on education. So for instance, if I start thinking about this and looking at the kind of reporting on the exposure to data owners as part of the kind of the fourth stage and the 10th deliverable, I don't have to assign to custodians. I can also assign this to departments. I can also educate staff. So using deliverable 11 here to again, those pop-ups, reminding people that perhaps, although it's allowed as part of our AUP, we don't recommend you continue because, again, there's a risk to you. Number 12 is around educating. Again, looking at identifying broken business processes. The number of organizations we work with that realize they have these business processes that are very established, but are broken. They have third parties they never knew that they were utilizing, not just from a cloud service perspective, but again, their third party, the use of certain data elements going to them. Again, this helped them educate and build out a much improved governance function. And then moving on to that governance function specifically, right? So deliverable 13 is looking at buy down risk improvements. And again, as a CISO, I always need to show ROI. I need to show how I focus on breach cost reduction, operational efficiency. I regularly report this, as I said, to the board using our analytics tools. And deliverable 14 is around looking at the cycle of governance. So when we see new risks getting flagged, It's always great that you move above the noise and you're not just showing kind of metrics for metrics' sake. As I said, context is key, making sure your governance reporting showcases a good outcome for you and your organization. Ultimately, to the point where you're looking at, you're running this as a cycle approach, and you're getting to the point where you can now start automating policy decisions, because you have that data available that can aid you with those policy decisions. You can automate risk reporting, and even you can automate third-party risk management. That's, I know, a key goal for many of our customers today is to get to that point, and they're on that path to that. So that's the model. That's the simple 5 stages, 15 key deliverables. The common question I always get is, how long does this take, and how many people do I need to assign to this? For most organizations, again, it's moving from discover to protect within 90 days. And usually past that, it's probably another 90 days to focus on education, gleaning metrics, and focusing on governance. So in total, again, 180 days from start to finish. Some organizations, of course, may take longer, depending on the size. Some organizations, again, sometimes can even reduce that below the 180 days. But as I said, it really depends on the size of the organizations. So again, I wanted to kind of finish off really with a review around some of the other things, again, that we see as a priority for organizations, especially around the governance approach. So building out customizable data visualizations. Again, these are my just an example of some of the reports that I share. So I've got my CISO dashboard daily that covers all of the cloud threats that have been identified, the cloud risks. I've got my compliance and privacy dashboard, which shows, again, data movement. So I can see kind of from source to destination, country, device, application, data. And I use this, for instance, for all of my GDPR reporting. So I can see, again, I use this for my Article 30 record of processing. This feeds my GRC tool. It's a great report to use. And then again, I have my ops dashboard, my view, that I can look at, again, specific cloud threats, be they malware, be they insider type threats. I see that and have that visibility. So again, to finish off, again, perhaps just a quick run through of some of the benefits here that I've spoken about. So one, simplifying, reducing complexity, focusing on improving user experience is key. The SASE model is fantastic in doing that, because again, helps with reducing latency while also applying security. Safely enabling the use of SaaS PaaS IaaS services. Again, we can't say no, we can't block them. We have to say, again, we can block them if there's a high risk to the organization. But in most cases, think about how we apply controls. That's key. Data protection and threat protection 3 and 4 are really combined, right? One thing what I always see organizations focusing on is, if you see a threat, you need to know what happens next. If for instance, you're running a piece of malware in a sandbox and it tells you how that malware is executing, that's great. But I need to know, if that malware was to execute, what would be the kind of the intention? If somebody was to access information and look to perform data exfil, I need to know that as well. I need to combine those 2 elements. Point 5 is around managing, automating third-party risk, and actually reducing that third-party risk, not necessarily just accepting it. And then actually the benefits of all of this as well, we can start thinking about how we reduce costs through transformation. So reducing those costs is key, as I said at the beginning of the presentation. That's something that most CIOs, CISOs are looking at right now. A combination of the current situation we're in, but also realizing they're kind of moving away from this legacy model, hub-spoke legacy model, to again of a SASE future, and that's where cost savings can also be again a good option, a good measure to start sharing with, again, the broader organization. So with that, I think we have probably a little bit of time for Q&A, and there is another poll. Actually, perhaps we spin that up quickly now while we're taking questions. So the final poll is, I mentioned those 5 stages, and it'd be great for you to kind of share where you think your organization is in relating to that 5-step security model. So are you, again, the first phase, are you in the discovery, learning about how, again, the shadow IT apps you have? Are you at looking at prioritizing that? So stage 2. So you've got the information, looking to prioritize. Are you already enforcing policy and putting in protection? Are you, again, looking at educating employees? You're already using the post-event activities from the protect to educate people, or are you in the kind of the fifth stage of the kind of governance approach? So as we go through those questions again, I'll hand back to Jeremy, and hopefully we can take some questions for the next few minutes.
So, thanks very much. I'll take none of that personally at all. And I would say that yes, maybe I'm not a technophobe, but I think I could be what's called a consumer phobe. Just moved over to iPhones, having had one arm forced behind my back from the wife. But I'm more of a one device would be nice person, if that's one concept about the change in what we're doing. I think it'd be really important, obviously, to get some of the ideas around the how do you educate employees poll. Now the questions were: are you incorporating education into annual security awareness training? And just for your notes, Neil, that took 47%. Are you running regular cloud security training workshops specifically focused on SaaS, IaaS, and PaaS? And that got a phenomenal 6%. Applying block policies in our CASB, so thumbs up to some of those people who are that 12% there. And applying pop-up warnings to warn employees of high-risk activities in CASB, 6%. So an overwhelming majority in that top bar, with a bottom 17 to 20% saying they don't make employees aware of cloud security risks.
Thank you for being honest, by the way. That's great. It's important that we hear that information as well. So,
what would you say to people who, I guess, are at the top end of that, who are saying 47%? They're obviously taking it seriously. They're obviously doing annual security awareness training. Amongst everything else, this year particularly has been extremely hard to get people, consumers, IT users to focus on those areas. What advice would you give to people in that top tier, that 47%, who are on the beginning of that journey? Which elements do you think would be easiest to take up, considering the space we're in at the moment, with the majority of people not interacting with IT as regularly as they should do?
Yeah, I mean, I still think it's great that people the results are coming in, and it is something that organizations are doing. I think it's great. I mean, cloud security, again, as I mentioned, adds another series of variables to that. So location is one. Again, we always talk about this, is that cloud is actually, all it is somebody else's computer. Now, you wouldn't intentionally send confidential data to someone else's computer unless you were sure that they were going to protect it. So ensuring that type of messaging is getting through is key. The only downside, and again, this is just from my experience, is that annual security awareness training, even if you make it so fascinating and intriguing and people want to even go off and do it again, perhaps, I think it's really unlikely that happens, but you'll still have this concern around people forgetting. And I think if anybody's read Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, people will forget. And when they're faced with a certain situation, I think John highlighted this, a great analogy, right? The path, choosing the path. Even if you had to sign there, and that sign was there for a period of time, and then you took it down, people would still follow and go for the easiest path. People forget. People need to be reminded of the risks. So for me, again, I think it's looking at maturity. So keeping the regular security awareness training, keeping people engaged, keeping people motivated, but reminding them more frequently of these kind of things. And again, if you're not putting in CASB, or you're not putting in pop-up warnings, which, by the way, again, we've seen the success of organizations doing this. It's fantastic. They're using these metrics. If you're not able to do that, then again, perhaps just regular newsletters or regular focuses on these kind of things, right? Referring to and highlighting the risks that cloud brings, I think, is important.
Yeah, I'm not a cynic. I think one of the great things about working with, actually, when you were working at WebSense, there was that introduction of the green, amber, red focus for pop-ups on users and what they were doing. I think for me, they're very much a very good signpost. Do you see that the pop-up is, do you think it works? Do you think it changes user behavior? Have you seen indications that that's a very strong way for people to go? It'd be good to have an indication that is something people can take on amongst the 5 steps. But is pop-ups a strong area to work in?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one of those things you have to make sure that you're not also impacting productivity. So if I'm getting 50 pop-ups a day, I'm just going to start ignoring them. So, and it's making sure, again, going back to that how you prioritize certain things and how you enforce policies. You shouldn't have a pop-up for everything. It really should only be when, again, the risk is too high for the organization to accept, and there needs to be some form of positive assurance made by the employee that they're doing the right thing and they understand the risks. That really should be the only time this is applied. And I gave the example before, right? This organization we work with, as just one example, but they talk about this at every one of our advisory board meetings, the value of sharing those metrics, and even going back to department level, showcasing the worst kind of offenders per department. They don't do this by employee. No, we shouldn't really be pulling out and pointing fingers at individual employees unless there's an incident we have to investigate. But even using this kind of as a department level form of highlighting, well, perhaps that department handles more sensitive data. Perhaps they need some further training. Perhaps they need to now do more regular training. Those are the kind of things that can really help. So yeah, it does. I mean, it's positive enforcement of certain activities and actions, and I think that's where the kind of the value lies.
Yeah. No, I think the really good thing about it, and again, we're now stealing that analogy from John once more, but for me, it's about the importance of establishing areas where you need to build that new path. Those two pictures were fantastic, but do we need to build a new path? And actually, are those people without naming names, as it were, are those people actually giving us an indication of the direction the business should be going in? Mm-hmm. And we can only establish those with, as you're saying in step one, that sort of discover phase where we actually are continually going through that pathway. So whilst those 5 steps are incredibly important, I would say that you always continuously need to review each step on a regular basis.
Yeah. It's a cycle. Yeah, it's a feedback loop like most things within security, right? You need to always go back and again, if there's a new service being implemented, again, that's part of discovery. Again, who does it belong to? What type of data is going to be hosted? What contracts do I have in place? What protection do I then need to put in? At that stage as well, you could be asking, what native controls does the provider have? What controls are they going to be responsible for? What controls am I going to be responsible for as a security team? And yeah, it's just a constant cycle. But as I said, there's many stakeholders as part of that. As I said, there's GRC teams, internal audit teams. If you don't have those teams, then it kind of falls on the security and IT teams to run some of those things. But again, there are tools out there that can really help you identify that risk. An example is, again, work with an organization. They had 2,500 cloud apps. They were spending 4 days per application performing an assessment on that app. That's 10,000 days of somebody's time, right? They had a team of 4 people. So it just wasn't going to be sustainable. So using the technology, the tools to perform 90% of that work for them, to give them a risk score, to make that education piece really important, that was where they were going. And it was, again, that's how they moved forward with that challenge.
I'm just going to move on to the to some of the ways in which we can help together. Well, I guess one of the points that's on here is in the discovery phase. Now, I think the good news for a number of customers is that there may well be tools in the organisation whose functionality they haven't quite realised yet, where there are some cloud application risk assessments available. But I really encourage all of you to take the time to reach out to the various contacts within Bytes to understand how we can help you deliver potentially a more complete cloud application risk assessment. Understand how to deliver those either in a positive light. Shadow IT risk assessment is another one that we provide, but I think the important thing is we want to make sure we're showing the direction in a positive light. One of the areas that's, from my perspective, been least used, but certainly is something I'd really encourage, is the cloud security snapshot. I had the pleasure yesterday of presenting in a hybrid cloud workshop. The reality of it is that, and Neil touched on it, my cloud or your cloud, whose cloud, where is the cloud, those areas and how we're controlling them. Cloud security snapshot is an excellent way of looking at governance and risk around those areas as well. And following that, having a cloud security alignment workshop is a great way of talking to people who are exploring those on a daily basis. So I really encourage customers to specifically look at those. We're obviously providing Office 365 security assessments. And again, I think that this is another area that's very much open to customers of Bytes, specifically because obviously Microsoft is a huge area of our business. So those accompanying technologies that we're working with, we're obviously part of the vehicle that's taking your business on that journey. So I really encourage you to reach out and ask questions about those. The other two are really, really important, and are areas that perhaps help us understand where these particular topics sit across the whole of your security strategy. So please do reach out and talk to us about a cybersecurity workshop. We're obviously very strong now in exploring where this sits from a business perspective. Neil obviously talked about a lot of people don't necessarily have GRC teams. They don't have, you might not have a multitude of teams within your business. Well, you might need to realign some of those in order to become more effective at aligning your security strategy with new business challenges. And we're certainly here to help explore those, potentially to look at maturity risk scores against the current climate. And the last one is a very simple form that we've obviously been persuading people to take advantage of across the course of this week's exercises, and that's a CIS controls gap analysis. Many of you will be familiar with those. The idea of this is to give people an opportunity to refocus after the last 18 months. Many patterns have changed. There's a significant amount of technical debt within our customers that we really want to help people expunge and help them move very, very quickly forward to reassessing their security strategy and tool sets. So please do take the time to think about some of those areas that are available. I really encourage you to reach out. And I think that from the first 3 steps that we can take in Neil's 5-step process, those first 3 are certainly an area we can help talk about in the first instance. But I think we can also help with all 5 of those steps across the various different assets and various different areas we have in play. So moving on to an open Q&A session for myself and the 2 esteemed gentlemen that we've had today. And this is, as you might imagine, this is a particular topic that I feel is, I guess, a leader in terms of where customers find themselves today. And I spoke earlier about how do we keep pace with innovation, and how much of a big role SWG and CASB specifically have in driving that path forward. I'm going to speak to Neil very briefly and say a lot of people are trying to align themselves with various different frameworks and practices for security, and rightly so, because they need guidance in understanding where to take things forward. I just want to understand whether there was any particular model you were focusing on with those 5 steps, or indeed how those 5 steps align with other frameworks such as NIST, for example.
Yeah, so it's to be honest, they're the best of them all. That's the best way to explain it. So, for instance, if anybody's familiar with NIST, you'll know it's identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and you can see that kind of very similar across the 5-step model. For ISO, I've actually created an ISO mapping guide as well for how this kind of maps into ISO. And even for the Cloud Security Alliance, so the work that I do with the CSA, how this kind of maps into some of their cloud controls matrix work as well. As I said, it kind of takes the best of all those things. I mean, the next thing I do need to do then is probably do a full-on mapping exercise across the 5-step model with the alliance to the ISO, NIST, and CSA frameworks as well. But as I said, I mean, for most organizations, they're focusing on those. They're using those frameworks, the existing frameworks. It's just adding on, again, the additional variables that cloud brings.
I think the challenge for a lot of us, and I guess we talk about, as I was saying before, CIS controls as an area for people just to think about basic focuses of where their technology stack really lies. I think what we're finding is that, not deliberately, but I think just through the course of change and the acceleration of digitization, that when we look at those controls and how they really interact with business today, people are just starting to lag slightly behind. But there's definitely a consciousness of it, and that's the most important thing. So moving on to, we talked about the different clouds there. John, the question I think really falls, and we had a really good interaction in terms of questioning around the people coming into organizations, how they were determining which clouds or what clouds they were using and actually being driven in that sense. Who do you think, or who should we be thinking about who owns responsibility for cloud in most organizations? Who is actually owning that? Is the business owning that? Are users owning that? How can we help attribute ownership to cloud in an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is it's actually quite balkanized. There are different elements of cloud which are owned by different parts of the business, and they're not always collaborating. So a really easy example of that is the massive uptake in cloud platforms like Microsoft 365, where that's been very much driven by the business as a business tool, and the network and security teams have just had to scramble to make it work. It's not being developed in partnership. It's been one part of the organization that says, this is what we're doing, make it happen. And you get similar aspects when you start talking about the performance and the security elements, which Neil was touching on earlier as well, which is where the network team often has dominance because it's all about the performance and making sure things are quick. And again, depending on the organization, one of the network or the security team will tend to be the dominant party, and the other one will have to follow on. And it's usually the network guys who have primacy, I think. And we see this in organizations of all sizes, whether it's 40, 50 users up to 400, 500,000 staff. It's the same thing. It's usually the network team who get primacy over security, sadly. But then the network team plays second fiddle to the line of business decision makers. The most effective organizations actually have kind of like a governance team where those three groups work together. But in my experience, let's say it's a lot rarer than it should be.
Sorry, my dog was barking there. I put it on mute and then completely forgot that I put it on. So apologies, everyone. I was thinking back there to I guess the movement in organisation. We're transitioning. Everyone's transitioning to adopting it. And Neil, you made an interesting point about SASE, and for a number of people, Bytes really jumped on this idea. Actually, the emergence of SASE as a concept. Now 18 months ago, in terms of Gartner's, I guess, determining of that particular focus. I think what we're seeing is a slow realization of that. You mentioned that most organizations are already on that path. What activities or what questions would you recommend people ask the organization or ask themselves or other teams in businesses about what that architecture or that sense of architecture really means, so that they're in a position to make the best decisions moving forward in terms of strategy? I'm sure you speak to lots of organizations where you're sat there and already your mind's going, gosh, you're definitely on this journey. How do I best articulate that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So as I said, most organizations are on the journey and they're on a maturity curve to this. Like with everything, there's always a good maturity curve behind it. And I think what you're seeing, obviously the last year has really accelerated some of the things, right? So for instance, employees using their own devices, accessing more cloud services. Those things we already know exist. We know the majority of data is moving out of data centers up into the cloud. We know infrastructure organizations have done the cost comparison exercise already. They've run through the economic benefits of moving to cloud, and they're moving their infrastructure. So it usually means sitting down with the networking teams, the security teams, the architecture teams, and building out this model. But the questions, again, you should be asking really is, again, am I looking to go with kind of SASE? Am I looking to go hybrid? I think most organizations will be slowly transitioning certain types of technologies, again, to a kind of SASE model. It's not going to happen overnight. It's probably the best way to explain that. So it's looking at how you prioritize these things. And I think, to be honest, the majority of times we're seeing those technologies that are struggling under the load to support remote workers and those workers that are directly accessing cloud services. There's that move to, again, like secure gateways to the cloud, where again, we've also seen this, right? There's been an increase in the use of traffic that's encrypted. I mean, almost 90% of traffic is now encrypted. So you really are going to start struggling to start thinking about your future traffic profile in 3 to 5 years' time, and try to run this with kind of traditional secure gateways. It has to be a hybrid, or it has to be SASE really to support that. The thing is, the controls are also needed. So that's where the security team comes in and says, look, yes, we want to apply threat protection and data protection, because we know that web and cloud are sources of malware and threats. So we need to apply threat protection and data protection there as well. And it's working with those teams, those networking and security teams, to devise a kind of a long-term transformation program to SASE. So yeah, you have to involve every team. It's quite difficult because there can be politics at play. I'm probably not the first person to ever say that. There's usually politics between those teams. But I think it's working with, again, partners, working with the kind of technology vendors, trying to highlight the benefits across the kind of the teams here, the benefits that they can actually bring. My first slide I highlighted, just show that first slide. If everyone agrees, right, they want reduced costs, centralized management, config, again, better impact and better performance for the users, all those kind of things. Show that, and again, I think that will resonate with most people.
We're sort of over time fractionally, but I'm keen to ask kind of one more question on this. I guess on this journey of change, because I'll be honest, I was very much a 5-day a week in the office kind of guy pre-COVID. One, because I felt that it was the best way for me to be productive. I felt it was the best way for me to be in touch with my team about how to be productive amongst the business. There's 120 salespeople, 3,500 customers. How on earth do I do that from home? So I'm one of many people who's effectively using my home network as an extension into my organization's network. John, we talked earlier about that change, and you were very focused on those different elements there. One thing I think all three of us agree on is we need to help customers align themselves with what SWG and CASB really mean to people now. I don't want to talk about SASE too much of a model, because really it's an architectural philosophy to a degree, right? Yeah. You can attach to that in different ways. Just briefly before we finish, it'd be great to hear about the positive elements that adopting an SWG with a CASB enables people to reduce risk from those people like me who will probably spend less time in the office now and more time working from home, and potentially a one device is nice kind of guy. And will it be a work device? Most likely. But what sort of additional safety measures are those kind CASB and SWG going to bring to customers in the short term?
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit difficult not to touch on SASE towards the end of the answer, but let's see how we go. So I like to break down, if you like, the functional roles of SWG, CASB, data security. They're all ultimately going to be components which merge in together. When we talk about SASE is for convergence of content and network security, right? So they will inevitably begin to merge as SASE matures and evolves. But the microservices within that, it kind of stays the same. Although there is overlap between them, the secure web gateway is predominantly there to provide some access control. Am I allowed to go to that web page? Am I allowed to go to that cloud application, and so on? Right, that's one of its primary bits of value. And then it can, if a decision is yes, you're allowed, it can then provide all kinds of real-time categorization, security analytics, etc., etc. For me, I think the greatest value from CASB, although it can do access control, is actually in activity control. All right. So once, if you like, the SWG microservice has said, yes, you're allowed to go, the CASB microservice will then define what you're allowed to do when you get there. Are you allowed to upload, download, share, launch new service in your IS platform, whatever it may be, right? And then on top of both of those, you then have additional microservices which are consumed. Okay, so they will both, for example, want and need to consume data security services, so that if you're downloading files, you don't want to just check them for threats. You want to, they might be coming from your repositories. So when you're downloading them from your repositories, you want to make sure that the person downloading them is actually allowed to have that. If it's with the other way with the CASB, if you're sharing files, so if you're creating things within these platforms, are you putting content in the right places? Are you treating it in the right way? Again, it's a little bit of a flippant example, but it's a genuine one. With PCI, card data needs to be stored encrypted. So is it being stored encrypted when it's been stored within the cloud platforms, for example? That's the sort of thing which a CASB component can enforce as part of that storage. Or if you're sharing it, is it being shared over an encrypted channel rather than clear text, and so on?
I think there's. I think what I was going to say is I think there's room for as we're knocking on to miles over time here. There's definitely room for potentially the three of us to have different conversations and maybe do some short additional webcasts on some additional questions around how to move this forward. I think we're sat on a number of platforms, ideas, and strategies that are just absolutely vital to all businesses moving forward. So first of all, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. I think personally I've let this overrun because I'm very much interested in articulating this particular topic. And secondly, to everyone who's managed to stay on over for the last 6-7 minutes, thank you very much for attending. To those of you on the next session, go and grab yourself another tea, as that seems to be the most appropriate drink of the day. Yes, lastly, thanks very much, gents, and look forward to speaking to you both, hopefully very soon.
I would love that. Thanks, Jez. Thanks, Neil. Been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.